Greetings, so this is the conversation with Esther Stanford-Xosei from the Racial Justice Network's group collective, the Race and Climate Collective. So my name is Cy Murray, and I'm going to be hosting the conversation today. And there's plenty of people behind the scenes as well, who will be jumping in and if necessary. But it's great to be here. Great to welcome you. And I think, yeah, do say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're from. We also have a Q&A. So while Esther is presenting, hold those questions and you can add them to the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. Also, do use the hashtags 13 recommendation, which I'll explain for those who don't know what that is. But also you can reach us on Race Justice on Twitter and the Racial Justice Network on Instagram. And Esther's hashtag on Twitter is Jose. Brilliant. So yeah, it's my real pleasure to begin. And first of all, before I introduce Esther, I will give some background to the Racial Justice Network Race and Climate Collective. So I will move through some of these slides. So yeah, this is the agenda we have. So we're going to introduce Esther. We're going to have a 10-minute break where we show a film which we created together with Mama D's Words, who will be appearing to close the event. And then Esther will be in conversation with some prepared questions, and we'll have an open Q&A following that. Okay, so yeah, this group, the collective, I'm very honoured to be a part of this, and it began just before lockdown in 2020, which seems a long time ago now, and it came about from an engagement we had as the Racial Justice Network with the a Leeds citizens jury, which was a climate jury which took place in the city where we're located. And there were certain recommendations made to the council of how to deal with climate change that we're experiencing and going to experience, and people obviously are already experiencing. So myself and Penina were there speaking on issues of race, connecting the idea that we must think global and act local, and this is what we've done with our various organising and networks, and this is some of the information we're sharing with the jury. So despite the recommendations that were decided upon, we continued this work, and we held a collective conversation around climate justice. Like I said, just before lockdown, with invited guests of Mama D, Leon Seeley Huggins, and real. Quite a big room. It feels like one of the few big gatherings we had over the last year before that, and we really took the impetus from that meeting to meet separately and to continue educating ourselves and linking with global activists around these issues. And these are some of the principles that we devised and we came up with together. Around colonial legacies, around the importance of international perspectives, the interconnectedness of issues, solidarity to the people who are on the front lines of climate justice and the fight, and obviously solidarity to all those who are victims and who are on the brutal end of the hostile environment and Fortress Europe. So that's the hashtag you can use. Internationalism, your legacy, and activist solidarity are the themes, and so it's a great pleasure from that work and being in conversation with Esther for many years. I think I first met Esther back in maybe 2005 or 6, around a time when Ngugi wa Thiong'o was visiting Leeds University, which is a happy coincidence following the conversation that we had the previous week. So since that time, Esther's been monumental and instrumental in many pioneering actions in the fight for justice, linking the issues of ecocide and genocide throughout lots of various different groups. Esther's full bio is on the event listing, and there's so many videos you can look up to look at Esther's work, and I recommend doing that to really getting a broad look at some of the groups and actions that Esther is involved in. I mean, personally, I really admire Esther as someone who I think is able to move between different groups, different communities, but really maintaining that integrity of a broader vision, a reparatory justice vision, which I'm sure she will go on to explain some of that. Not the entirety of everything Esther does, because it's a lot, but we're going to get a real education, I think, and a grounding in some of the links that Esther has globally, internationally, and some of the things that will help us all bring about the justice that we need. So without further ado, I will welcome my good friend, colleague, sister, and also this is the first public-facing event we've held with Esther. We've met with Esther at the Reparations March in 2020. Esther came up to Leeds to run a reparations course for us, but this is the first event that we are honoured to welcome Esther as our patron. So give it, round of applause. We can't hear you, but I'm giving you a round of applause, Esther, and thank you very much for agreeing to share this space with us. And over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Am I able to share my screen?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I will make you host now.
Co-host, yeah, co-host is fine.
Let me do that. Let me see. Is anyone else able to do this for me?
Yes, you have co-hosting rights now.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Will as well. So we have technical help from Kenya, which we should mention. Thank you very much. Brilliant.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying I'm co-host now. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it on my end. So I'm just trying to make the screen bigger, but yeah, I'm not seeing that at all. My co-hosting. Okay, now I can see. Okay. So hopefully you can see. Right. And yeah, I'm just making sure that I can also share sound. Hopefully you're seeing a screen, a picture with me. You can see that, right? Okay, good. Okay, greetings. Thank you, Sai, Panina, and others, part of the Racial Justice Network. It's good to get an opportunity to just do this session with you. Brief session. I'm not known for being brief, but I've got a brief time tonight to just explore some points on our topic, reparations and the climate justice movement. And I'm primarily a reparationist. I hope that you're hearing me well. I'm primarily a reparationist, which is a reparations scholar, activist, campaigner. And so all of the work I do around climate justice is through the lens and the prism of the framework of reparations, which I will talk a bit about in a short while. But obviously it's important for us when we're thinking about injustices and climate injustice, environmental injustice, racial injustice, you know, the multi-layered nature of injustice, to recognize the importance of having that holistic picture of what the problem is, what it is that we're seeking to tackle, and the roots of the current movements that we all are part of or support or are concerned with in some way, shape or form. So in terms of climate justice, I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail about anything with the time that I have, but just trying to go methodically through some thought processes. Climate justice, bringing together frontline communities of resistance, recognizing that they also have solutions to extractive industrial systems that are eroding humanity's primary means of existence on the planet. And obviously in the current situation of ecological and climate and ecological crisis, and all the other crises that go with that, that are not disconnected from the crisis of racism, anti-Black racism. And in my case, I particularly like to emphasize Afrophobia, anti-African prejudice and discrimination, and also the crisis in terms of pandemics, such as COVID-19. They all obviously impacting on people, not only ourselves, but our families and communities around the world and other members of the human family. So we know that effective solutions also build on existing human peoples and also Mother Earth rights, or so-called rights of nature, but the notion of Mother Earth rights in terms of countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, I'm thinking of in particular here. And the championing of community rights to energy, land, water, and food sovereignty are key aspects of tackling climate and ecological injustice or crisis. So when we think about climate justice, it is important to recognize that key groups in society who have been historically oppressed, marginalized, and who have experienced colonization in particular are most affected or more affected by climate change and ecological destruction. And then within specific groupings historically, maybe national groupings or in a European context or Western context, racially marginalized groupings, then we know within that other groupings such as women, disabled people, etc., that are more impacted across the world in terms of climate injustice. Of course, we know that climate impacts can exacerbate existing inequitable social conditions, and therefore it's important for us to explore the solutions that we're engaged in and to try and ensure that there is fairness and equity, and that we have to look at not only justice between or among, contemporary generations, but also, intergenerational justice as well, in terms of the world that we've inhabited and also the world that we're passing on to those that are yet to be born, okay? So that's really what we're concerned with from my perspective when I think about climate justice. So recognizing that there are a plethora of movements that come together around tackling climate injustice from different perspectives. And that is really, really key, because it's not just a one size solution that's going to fit all because of the nature of injustice. So I just have this slide here that promotes a study of Jason Hickel, who does a lot of research on these issues of climate injustice, ecological crisis, linked to the notion of colonization and also some aspects of reparation. And so he took part in this study. He conducted this study that is known as Colonizing the Atmosphere, which tells us that as of 2015, the USA was responsible for 40% of excess global CO2 emissions. That's no surprise, I know to any of you. The European Union, in terms of the 28 countries, was responsible for 29%. G8 nations, including the USA, EU, Russia, Japan, and Canada, were responsible for 85%, and countries classified by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as what's known as Annex 1 nations, those being the most industrialized countries, were responsible for 90% of excess emissions. The global north was responsible for 92%. By contrast, most countries in the global south were within their boundary fair shares, including India and China, global according to new analysis by Hickel in the study Quantifying National Responsibility for Climate Breakdown, which was actually published in the September 2020 issue of the Lancet on Planetary Health. And a quote from him is that we know that the global south suffers more than 90% of the costs of climate breakdown, and 98% of the deaths associated with climate breakdown due to fires, floods, droughts, famine, disease, displacement, and so on. So he goes on to say, so just like under colonialism, the North is benefiting at the expense of the South. And of course, that doesn't dismiss that within the global North, you have the global South too, in terms of racially marginalized communities from the majority world who are disproportionately impacted. So the simple fact of the matter is that countries and people who are least responsible for causing climate change are the ones who are suffering most from its effects, especially regarding food insecurity and nutrient deficiencies. So thinking about that within the context of tackling, climate injustice in terms of the climate justice movement and reparations, it's a huge problem, a huge intergenerational, structural and systemic problem that we have to tackle. And of course, that will be done in a multiplicity of ways. So I'm going to now go on to, I hope that you're going to be able to hear that. Can you hear that sound? And when we talk about ecocide, we have to recognize that part of the way in which ecocide has manifested has been because of the genocide of people who were custodians of our earth, whose ways of life was about living in harmony with all creation and all our relations. And that is what has got interrupted. We cannot have ecological repair, climate repair, without racial justice repair. Because it was that reordering of the world and categorizing people in hierarchical fashion that has resulted in where we are at today. So we bear witness today that despite the intention that we were never going to survive, that we are here. We are here, though, to be a wake-up call for the conscience of humanity. So that was just a bit of a soundscape from actually me at the last Extinction Rebellion activity in September of last year. making the links between the current ecocide and genocide and colonization. And that's important in terms of looking at not only reparations or reparatory justice, as I prefer to say, but also how do we develop effective solutions in terms of tackling or stopping the current harms of extractivism today that are proliferating genocide and ecocide against, obviously all of us are impacted, but to different degrees. And so in the Pan-African perspective of the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign that I am part of, this warrants an understanding that in stopping the harms of genocide and ecocide, that we not only have to emancipate and save ourselves, but this process of stopping the harms today and repairing the damage by way of reparations must also result in the repair of humanity, the planet, and indeed the cosmos. Now I'm going to skip through because I know that I've got limited time, but just to say this is just some of the preliminary context to then exploring the notion of reparations. The fact that as much as the fact, you know, the British government have recognised the declaration of a climate and ecological emergency, they are still funding fossil fuel projects in the global south, and in particular I'm focused here in these slides on Africa. And so this should be disturbing to us if we're working here to try and address these issues not only within our local communities but also looking at the global impacts and responsibility that nations like the UK have in the world. Okay, so that moves us on to talk about the notion of reparations. And there has been, within the context of reparations, a recognition of what's known as climate reparations. And there is a scholar, Dr. Keston Perry, based at the University of West England, and this is just from a paper he gave, An Internationalist Approach for the 21st Century on Climate Reparations, pointing out that the effects of emissions have been visible in, for instance, the hurricanes that precipitate wide losses to agriculture, fishery, tourism, deforestation, coastal erosion, housing, infrastructure, and the loss of Black lives, with the greatest impact on women and children. And he goes on to talk about some of the damages in terms of, you know, not full damages, but in terms of hurricane damage in the Caribbean and small island states that show how serious this issue is for particular lives in particular regions, you know, of course, in the context of the Caribbean. So that's what this slide talks about. And he actually argues that climate reparations constitute a program for loss and damage to livelihoods, infrastructure, and people's life chances due to ecological breakdown. Now, the notion of climate reparations, and I would actually advocate the term planet repairs, which I'll go on to talk more about, is very much part of the substance of a case that we are supporting as the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, which is known as the Young People or Global Majority versus the UK government. And this is the case of 3 young co-claimants, Marina Trix, Adetola Anamade, and Jerry Amakwando, who are based here in the UK, but working with Plan B, the climate litigation charity, have been able to initiate legal proceedings against the UK government and the Chancellor and the Energy Secretary, really exploring the question of the UK's obligations to implement the Paris Agreement domestically. And what's interesting about this case is although you could say it's a climate justice case seeking to avert further harm that the UK government is doing, it's also being framed as a reparations case, but a reparations case with a difference in terms of a focus on the ecological and climate dimensions of reparations as they impact on these three co-claimants who are basically arguing, Britain, UK government, you are not only harming us, the younger generation, this generation, you are also harming our families back home. And our families back home, we are connected to them. So we are not going to be complicit in your further genocide and ecocide of our people. So I just wanted to show a quick clip from their own promotional video that also explains this.
Let's face it, the government is killing us and our families. They sell out our health and our futures for the fortunes of a few. We are the collateral damage. COVID-19 has shown it can be any of us. But workers, racially marginalised communities, and young people are on the front line.
And this government is not going to stop, because they serve polluters and big businesses who trade in crisis, debt and destruction, and who profit from pain. They're putting billions of pounds back into the pockets of millionaire companies who are funding the destruction of our futures, the futures of our heritage communities, whilst children in the UK are starving and being forced to go school days without food.
Boris Johnson is knowingly funding 4 degrees of warming, and he knows that that's genocide for our generation, for Africa, for Asia, for Abya or the so-called Americas, Latin America and the Caribbean, all small island states and all indigenous communities everywhere. We refuse to be complicit in this criminal betrayal. We refuse to betray our families globally, and we refuse to pay for our own deaths. Our silence is no longer violence, it's genocide.
And so we stand up now for our right to life. And as we do so, we do it together, collectively, and across borders, and realize our strength and ability to speak directly to power and to make the changes that we know we need.
During lockdown, we've been reconnecting with a sense of community and the potential for a better world. From south to north and across generations, we must support our communities. We must support initiatives for planet repairs, and we must fund those instead of our annihilation.
The government is in breach of its legal obligations to safeguard our rights to life, our rights to family life, as well as its international law duty to prevent harm to other countries. We do not and never did consent to all of these violations, and that's why we're taking the government to court, to fight for our right to life and to fight for our right to survive, to live and to thrive as a global family. It's either all of us or none of us.
So that is a case that the Stop the Mangamese campaign is supporting, working in partnership with Plan B and also the 3 co-claimants that you've just heard from. And our role is really to support with the campaign because, yes, whilst we're embracing, conventional court action, we know that the real victory is to be won in the courtroom of public opinion, the international courtroom of public opinion. So the Stop the Mangamese campaign's role is really around the extra legal dimensions of this case and how this case can catalyze communities across the world in terms of their own resistance and forms of rebellion. So in my closing comments, I now want to make that link in terms of reparations, which so many people are hearing about and getting involved with now. And I think it's important to say a bit about reparations in the full sense, because it's one of the most perhaps misunderstood, maligned, and also in danger of being co-opted movements at this time. And with all this crisis that's going on, this global crisis of racism, anti-Black racism, Afrophobia, pandemics, and obviously the climate and ecological crisis, I think it's really important that we have a thorough grasp of reparations. So just quickly taking us through international law, framework on reparations codified in 2005, which is known as the UN Guidelines and Principles on a Right to a Remedy and Reparation. It's got the long title there, which I haven't got the time to read. But the key aspects of reparations that I think, and I've kind of reordered the way it appears in the framework, but most people go to point 3 when they think about reparations. And even when we hear about solutions offered in terms of climate financing, it's really around measures of compensation. But that's as important as that is in terms of funding, adaptation and all of that, it still limits the scope of what holistic reparations are. And for me, one of the most important aspects that is underemphasized in public discourse is the cessation of violations, stopping the current harms, stopping extractivism, stopping multinationals, stopping what they're doing. We've got what's happening in the Okavango Delta. I mean, it's legion across Africa and other parts of the world, the way in which, despite what is known and despite all these movements and student protests in the global north, trying to hold governments in these countries to account, what is being exported in terms of the global south, and even in terms of some of the solutions that are being developed, if we don't have that global perspective, what we end up doing is actually replicating forms of colonial domination or neo-colonialism. So the ending or stopping of the harm, we in the Stop the Mangamizi campaign would say stopping the Mangamizi, assurances and guarantees of non-repetition, which is how do we ensure that this climate and ecological crisis, the racism, the destruction of lands and water bodies and our environment and our connection to land, how do we ensure that that doesn't happen again? And that's where I think we need to be focusing our efforts when we're thinking about reparations and climate justice movement. There's the notion of restitution, which is to put a people or a group back, even in terms of environment, to a state that it should be in, but for colonization, neo-colonization, extractivism, despoilation. And we know in countries like Nigeria with the Niger Delta, what's happening there in terms of even how long it will take to clean up that region. So quite a challenge. Compensation, which most people think about, is not just about money, but it's about putting an economic value on harm. And there are different ways in which that can be done. It might include notions of trade justice, rights to kind of benefit from what's coming off of the land and so forth. Measures of satisfaction, which are known as symbolic reparations, which are, often to do with changing curriculums and street names and rewriting a kind of narrative of how a people have come to be who they are, or how a nation has come to be what it is. It includes measures of holding corporations to account. So lots of lawsuits are happening trying to prevent corporations, and we've just heard about the Shell win as well. So that would come under that, and rehabilitation, which is really looking at rehabilitation of peoples, of communities that continue to be dispossessed. So that is the UN framework. But in the international social movement for African reparations, we also recognize what's known as the Chimwezi framework, which really looks at the notion of repair. okay, stopping the harm and being part of the repair. And the repair is at many different levels, repairing our relationships with not only ourselves and other members of the human family, but how we interface with our environment, the land that we live on, so much that is based on appropriation, expropriation, and furthering forms of dispossession. And so, you know, I'm not going to read all of the dimensions of it. Hopefully you can see the slide, but I'm just skipping through because I know I've probably only got about 2 or 3 minutes, so I've got to hurry up. And then what I wanted to share with you is explaining this notion of planet repairs that you heard in particular, I think it was Adetola say in the Global Majority Case video. So planet repairs is something that PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, that has been going for about 20 years, that co-founded the Stop the Mangamizi campaign, have been championing for some time in terms of making these links between you know, reparatory justice, environmental justice, and also cognitive justice. So myself and a scholar based at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Nicola Frith, we've both been involved with co-founding the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. This is a definition. Planet repairs refers to the need to proceed from a standpoint of pluriversality that highlights the nexus of reparatory, environmental, and cognitive justice in articulating the need to repair holistically our relationship with and inseparability from the earth, environment, and the pluriverse, giving due recognition to indigenous knowledges in contrast with Western-centric Enlightenment ideals that separated humanity from nature and thereby justified exploitation for capital accumulation. And so in my closing, because I know there'll be more time in terms of the questions, what is being advocated as repair, the notion, this is big picture stuff and there's lots of things that come under this, but I think it's important to mention the big picture stuff. This is an image here of the late Ken Saro-Wiwa, as we know, a Ogoni activist in terms of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, campaigning around one of the most, destroyed, sites in terms of ecocide that we have on the earth, really. And Ken Saro-Wiwa, whilst he is recognized for that, there's another aspect of what Ken Saro-Wiwa was really advocating by way of the vision for the repaired, not only Ogoni land and Nigeria, but how that interfaced with a repaired Africa. And he was really advocating the notion of forms of autonomy and self-determination for the Ogoni peoples that was linked to a restructuring of the borders of Africa that had been instituted with the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference. And so this notion of we need to not only change the way that we relate to land and look at how colonization has not only brought about land privatization and land dispossession and all the attendant human, peoples and Mother Earth rights that go with that, but it was also about what is the vision for a transformed geopolitical reality that is known as Africa today, and how that fits into a transformed world. And so in terms of the vision of the big picture vision, of which many things come under it, but there is this notion, which is an intergenerational notion of a unified Africa, but not unified on the basis of unifying current states in the United States of Africa, which is the agenda of the current African Union, but actually an Africa that can be unified along its own indigenous borders and ethnicities and nationalities. So this notion of a pan-African superstate, which is actually a union of communities, not based on the Westphalian model of statehood emanating from Germany and Western Europe, but this based on African philosophies and notions of how we live, not only in a just way with each other, but how we live in harmony with our Mother Earth. Okay, and so this notion of a state, a union of communities based on the principles of Ma'at, recognized and epitomized in the image of the goddess Ma'at, and the virtues of Ma'at in terms of truth, righteousness, harmony, balance, reciprocity, and justice and order, but also this combining this notion of Ma'at with Ubuntu, which recognizes that we are people through other people, and our humanity is best expressed with not only how we treat ourselves, but how we treat others. And the notion of Ubuntu is not just people-centered, it's also about how we relate to our Supreme Mother or our Earth Mother, in terms of Mother Earth. And so this is what is being advocated. And I guess in terms of us in the diaspora who are linking into this, and this is very much connected to repair in what we're championing. So there is a notion of satellite communities of Ma'at Ubuntu Man that are Ma'at Ubuntu Jammers, and Ubuntu Jammer in Kiswahili really speaking to this collective communities and villagization. And that's what is being advocated. So you have communities that are going to be energy sufficient, food sufficient, working on the land across the world, linking in organically to the mother continent. And imagine that transformation happening. So that kind of deals with the issues of denial of sovereignty and so forth. But I believe I need to stop now to allow for the questions that Sai is going to answer, and where I can talk more about some of the concrete work, other concrete work that engaged in around planet repairs, in particular as a way of tackling climate and ecological injustice and reparations at the same time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Esther. Yeah, I appreciate, obviously, there's a lot more you can contribute on these issues, and you have a whole other 30 odd slides there. So yeah, we'll get to as much of that as we can, and some questions. But as way of a interlude into those, we're going to share a video which we put together using Mama D's words on the 13th recommendation, which Esther features on as well. And also for those who were there at the Ngugi or Thiongo conversation the other day, we have our Kenyan friends there as well. So we're just going to share a 5 or so minute clip of that, and then we'll get into some questions. Do add your questions to the Q&A, which you'll hopefully see at the bottom of your chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Okay, here we go. Thank you.
This is the 13th recommendation, a grounding and a provocation. Who are we that we can determine what is and what is not relevant to any discussion which concerns the fate of our Earth? We are the Earth. We are, in each element of our being, part of the substance, the feeling, and the memory of this planetary being. In recollecting this, we remember ourselves as responsible for retaining the ebb and flow of planetary dynamics. But we are not alone.
let us move into becoming more present. Now is a time of acknowledgement. We are surrounded by beings with as much right to planetary balance as we each and collectively have, if not more, because many beings have been here long before we even materialized as humans. Consider our elders, the rocks, the mountains, the soil, the trees, the grass, and many species of animal, fungi, and unicellular and acellular life. Consider each of these as having even older forms in ancestral states of being, going back into the where and when of time, making that makes no sense to us as humans. Yet, do we even respect our elders?
Now, as you are seated, hearing my voice, feeling the air on your skin, the soles of your shoes beneath your feet on the carpet or the floor surface, aware of the weight you place on your seat, feel also the cloth touching your birth skin. Then remember, all of this is from the earth. It has been sacrificed in service to you without being consulted in the context of aggressive policy making, in the absence of grounded knowledge of the long-term consequences of its extraction, as a response to certain individuals' quest for personal accumulation and corporate greed, in which many of us are complicit in following habits, fashion, mindlessness, extractivist practices, and various protocols of irresponsibility.
But it's come to you, as various forms of convenience is also due to the ingenuity, repeated practice, application of intelligence, and a lot of unpaid or underpaid physical, mental, and emotional labour of those who came before us. Those we call ancestors, many of whom remain unnamed, uncited, considered irrelevant, or whose memories have been erased. Yet when did you, or when did we last give thanks?
Take this opportunity now to move your breath into a place of gratitude. With each breathed knowledge of yourself, your relationship of the state of things in which we find ourselves. As you breathe in, be inspired to move forward. Transformations, change. As you breathe out, commit to live inactivity behind. Breathe away the stillness of old habits that do not serve to you or us collectively. Behind, assured that we will be bringing today will support every breath you take to be profound and meaningful consequence. Ashe.
In traditional stories, we're often enabled a last chance to succeed, where the hero or heroine can reach their goal, achieve success, escape death or punishment. In many of these cases, the extra chance is enabled by a 13th spirit, the fairy, the angel, sprite, witch, or nature being, one that has the power on doing the spell or enactment that has been cast by those who have the power over the order of things. The extra embodiment of energy has the capacity to dissipate evil, to undo the terrible spell, to revoke the enchantment that everyone is fixated by. Often it has to be invoked to act against a kind of spell which has everyone apparently in a mode of deep sleep.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura, for sharing that video. That's just a teaser. The full video is on YouTube, and we'll get to the end of that later in proceedings. But yeah, that was a little example of some of the work that we managed to do over this period with the collective, the Race and Climate Collective, some of the international voices we've linked with there. We're now going to begin a conversation between myself and Esther before the Q&A. And I guess leading on from that idea of linking internationally, which we've managed to do a little of, it would be great to hear you talk, Esther, a little bit more about some of those links that you have internationally. And I guess particularly with one of the groups who I'm not sure you have mentioned in this talk, but the affiliation you have with XR and via the XR ISN, the XR Internationalist Solidarity Network. I've had many conversations with you around your work, and particularly on this grouping. And I know that there's also been some misunderstandings around the nature of this work. There's obviously, as we're aware ourselves and have critiqued ourselves, that there's a lot of critique, partly, a lot of it justified, around the lack of racial politics within XR. But this grouping, as you have shared many times, you and Clue and African Heritage Network were at the very beginning of the formation of XR, and so you've been intervening, been very aware of the racial dynamics, the policing issues and everything else. But I'm not sure many people who are organising our communities have the full understanding of the tactics and of the strategy that you're employing by working in affinity with a group such as XR. So,
Sure. So, do you want me to speak about that, which is a really important issue? Now, just to preface what I say, we had an involvement with XR before XR launched its declaration of rebellion in October 2018. We were actually contacted by a member of XR probably around the July of 2018 as the Stop the Mangamizi campaign. They contacted us, and I got an email because I was, responding to monitoring the email, and it was from somebody called Matthew, who said, "Oh, I'm looking at your website and the work that you do as a campaign, and I can see that you have the Stop the Mangamizi campaign petition action learners. I wanted to know, could I become one? But I'm a white man." So obviously when you get an email like that, which we don't, we're a African heritage community campaign. So it was an interesting email to get, and I was quite curious by it. So entered into a dialogue, and the long and short of it is that the person, Matthew, said to us, "Look, I think that we have something in common in that you are interested on tackling ecocide and genocide as a dimension of ecocide and vice versa. And as Extinction Rebellion, we are tackling these issues in terms of the climate and ecological crisis, but actually we recognize that people in Africa in particular are most impacted, and other parts of the global south." So that was the humble approach to us, which led us to then begin a form of dialogue with the XR co-founders. And we put to them many of the criticisms and everything that you hear about XR, of which you're all familiar, I don't need to repeat. We put that to them, and we also put to them our own skepticism about working with this white-led movement, recognizing the narrowness of its construction, etc., etc., etc. Anyhow, what we found from the co-founders, of which there were 11, okay, founded in Slough, so a limited kind of geographical and perhaps worldview as well. But they said to us, all right, we want to do an open letter, which was published in The Guardian, actually, in December 2020, at Now to Prevent an Environmental Catastrophe. And what they did is they said to us, how would you suggest we frame this issue? So we joined on to this letter that was signed by 100, academics and scientists and community leaders across the world. And we included particular text. And the text that we included in it was that we further call on concerned global citizens to rise up and organize against current complacency in their particular context, including Indigenous people's rights advocacy, decolonization, and reparatory justice. So joining the global movement that's now rebelling against extinction. So the commonality was, as the Stop the Manganese campaign, we are also rebelling, against extinction, not just in terms of, non-human species, but our very selves, the attempt to make us extinct, through genocide. The fact that we're survivors of genocide doesn't mean that, there aren't attempts to make us extinct in terms of depopulation, which actually still continues. So we made it very clear that many of us around the world and the communities that we work with in the Global South could not tackle climate. It's not a separate issue, that people were already engaged in struggles, climate justice, racial justice, food sovereignty, land struggles, and that those had to be the bedrock of how you engaged communities who were not white, the majority of whom, if they could find XR relevant. And so we went to the first Rebellion Day in October, the second one, the end of November, and we then began to enter into dialogue with XR co-founders, and we agreed that we needed to have our own space because we were concerned about the international dimensions of this climate and ecological crisis. We said it's fine for you all to worry about what might happen in 15, 20 years' time. But for many of our people, it's happening right now. The genocide is right now. We haven't got the time to wait. And that space was created, co-created, with the support of XR co-founders who understood reparations in the sense of redistribution of resources in particular that have been extracted from the Global South, because we made it very clear a lot of the resources that you're working with don't belong to you. They come from extraction and extractivism, and therefore if XR wanted to do justice, they needed to facilitate a redistribution of resources back into the Global South, which is what was agreed. And the setting up of XRISN, the XR Internationalist Solidarity Network, was a form of reparation in their mind, because that's how we explained it. And so we have a mandate, and the mandate is very clear. So although these other issues have been going on, what we've always said to people is, don't assume that everyone in XR is white. Some of us got involved because we know that eco-fascism is real, okay? And it is being unleashed against our people under the guise of tackling the climate and ecological crisis. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure within XR, as in many other spaces, there are eco-fascist tendencies. However, we also met other tendencies that recognize that Indigenous people needed to get their sovereignty back, African people needed to get their sovereignty back, that actually there is a debt, not a money debt, not just a money debt, not just an ecological debt, not just a climate debt, that there is a holistic debt owed to peoples of the Global South and their diaspora communities in the global north. And so that was what was the space that we carved out. And we recognized, look, a lot of people who joined XR, who were rebelling, we saw that as positive. We saw it as positive that white people were taking on this government, recognizing the genocidal impact of the policies of this government, because a lot of our people are not in a position to do that voluntarily. So if they want to take on their own people, that is fine. And let me tell you, all the rebellion days, in fact, we were shielded from arrest. It was made very clear that global South activists, diaspora community activists should not be arrestable, okay? So these are the narratives that don't get heard anyway. We formed XRISN. Our mandate is to foster mutually respectful, cooperative and beneficial connections with people from existing grassroots communities of resistance on the front lines of the climate and ecological crisis in both the global South and global North, who are working on environmental justice, so that one, these perspectives of rebellion, because the other thing we had to say to them is, look, you haven't started no rebellion. Our people have been rebelling against this system for centuries, okay? And that was an educational point, because a lot of them didn't know. They thought, oh, we're best thing since sliced bread. And it's only through that interaction and dialogue. So it's ensuring that XR know that there are other struggles that might not be framing themselves as climate justice struggles, environmental struggles, or so forth, but people defending land, stopping extractivism, stopping multinational corporations, those who are asserting, food sovereignty, all that multiplicity of struggle that's going on. We were saying to XR, there's a lot that you need to learn from us. And the second aspect of our mandate is ensuring the two-way learning. So that dialogue exchange. Now, concretely, what have we got out of it? Why are we there? We in the XRISN have been supported in terms of resources, okay? Let me be very clear, to support 3 partner networks in the Global South, where the majority of the money goes. And these are an XR Affinity All African Network. Now, these are affinity networks. They're not setting up XR groups, because we've said to our people in XR, our people don't need you. They don't need a colonial approach of white saviors coming to save us. Our people are saving themselves, but they can be in affinity around the basis of any common interest. So the one in Africa, which is called XRAN, there's an XR affinity network for Abya Yala, so-called Americas, called XRISE. There's an XR affinity network of Asia called XRANA, and they're based in India, Ghana, and Colombia, respectively. And if you know anything about Colombia in particular, one of the places where a lot of our people, indigenous people, so-called Afro-descendants, are being killed for being land defenders, human rights defenders. And one of our flagship projects in Africa is what's known as the Miano Asaseya Community Educational Complex and Sanctuary, which is a community space that is being built, purpose-built, to provide a sanctuary to persecuted activists across West Africa, and that is also promoting indigenous methods of averting the climate and ecological crisis, indigenous knowledge systems, and so forth. And in the UK, we've also been able to establish what's known as the GOPIS, the Gaia House of People to People's Internationalist Solidarity, because we're very clear that unless there is real, genuine internationalist solidarity, we have to ensure that those who are here who are often, whether they're complicit, whether they don't know, end up being utilized or benefiting from the dispossession of our people and other communities in the global south. So it's an internationalist solidarity center that is led by us. And that's the work that we do. It's not about street protests for everybody. That has its place, but it's not the prefigurating of the new world that we're much more interested in doing. And so we know that that cannot happen unless we get a groundswell of people resisting and rebelling against the system. And in Africa, that needs to happen. In the Caribbean, that needs to happen. And people rebel in the way that they feel best they can rebel. And a lot of rebellion has been about not just condemning what is here, but it has been about co-creating and constructing the new or the alternative.
Brilliant. And respect, honestly, for that, because I think a lot of African heritage communities, a lot of people of colour do find those spaces difficult, challenging, and would give up. I think that, as you outlined, there's harmful behaviours there to us and our communities. But
oh yeah, no, we have our own space, and trust me, those same harmful behaviours we call out. But rather than fight people and expect them to change, we have our own space. And in fact, what we've said, and I don't need to hide it, we have said, and we continue to say, XR is not safe for many of our people. That's why we need our own space. Okay, just the whole culture, organizationally, movement-wise, we want to go back to our ways of doing things. And that has been embraced. And what we're seeing now is that we're winning over a lot more people who didn't understand because we've stood our ground and been able to do this. And one of the things that we also champion with these 3 Global South partner networks is we have 3 main commemorative days that are opportunities to have this sharing of what we call a merge rebellion globalization strategy. And that means those who are the little rebels on the streets here doing what they're doing, we're not condemning that, but we're saying we've got our own methods and we can merge those. And so for the African heritage communities, one of the sites of rebellion is around reparatory justice, which we have a commemorative protest on the 1st of Mosiah, otherwise known as August. And so that is the activity that we gain support from some XR groups who come at the assistance, help block roads if we need to, because many of our people, are not putting themselves forward for that. But we're also trying to say, whatever people understand to be reparations, it's not going to happen because we beg or we have nice conferences or we write nice papers and say what is owed. People have to literally be prepared to take forms of non-violent direct action, as we did in the civil rights struggle, as we've done across African liberation struggles. That is also part of our history. And in fact, in the US, it was children that Martin Luther King and others utilized in terms of, civil disobedience. So we forget that we have these traditions, and many of the rights that we currently benefit from were because our people engaged in acts of civil disobedience, including arrestable offences, but that cannot be forced on any community or any individual. For the Asian network, we also promote the 30th of April as being what's known as the Peace Lotus Internationalist Solidarity Day of anti-war resistance. And that day is symbolic because it's the day of the ending of the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War and resistance against the war, including the ecocide and the genocidal dimensions of the Vietnam War that are still impacting on communities who were sprayed with Agent Orange and all of that, is a key rallying point in terms of Pan-Asian solidarity, but internationalist solidarity. Many of people of different, you know, ethnicities and nationalities were opposed to the Vietnam War and all other wars, and recognizing the links between war and ecocide and militarism, and the fact that US Army is like the biggest polluter on the planet, one of the biggest polluters on the planet. And in terms of the Abya-Yala diaspora, a promotion of the 12th of October as a key site of community resistance that unifies the communities, and the 12th of October, which was formerly known as Columbus Day and Day of Discovery, being reclaimed as an Indigenous people's resistance, Day of Indigenous Resistance in Abya-Yala. So these are what we hold up as diaspora communities for those that want to show solidarity with us as diasporas, but in terms of the issues that are impacting our communities who are in resistance back home, but whose resistance is not often reported on the BBC, in The Guardian, or even in many of our struggles. So it's really engaging with whole communities and their struggles, and amplifying those struggles in the global north and through our networks, through a different you know, range of mediums in particular.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's really good to flesh that out, because I do, as you say, I don't think a lot of people are aware of just how deep the work is and how carefully strategized it is. So, I mean, something we've witnessed attending the Reparations Rebellion, the Reparations March as RGN, is that bringing together of different communities. So, you know, from the Nation of Islam to XR, who you mentioned, to obviously the Rastafari community there from the beginning, Pan-Africanists, and publics interested in ecocide, genocide mitigation. So obviously there is a lot of cancel culture now, so-called cancel culture, and there's a lot of people off, there's a lot of you know, divide and rule that goes on. So could you speak to how you've managed to work with some of these groups? Because I've personally witnessed how, you know, how amazing the organization is that you have to put into that one day, and I know it's not more than one day, there's a whole lot of things throughout the year, but that is a particular showcase that shows the power.
Yeah, that day is really important, because on that day we do engage in symbolic actions. We hand in the Stop the Ma'angamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide petition, calling for the establishment of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, known as the ATSITAJ by acronym. But how we've been able to do it is that we recognise that reparations, or reparatory justice as I prefer to say, is the preserve of all our people. You know, if they truly understand what it means, how could one not be in support of reparatory justice? And so the day is a People's Day. It's the flagship day of action that celebrates an African heritage community, which is made up of many different communities and communities within communities, let's be very clear. But on that day, we put aside, or try to put aside, any ideological and political and philosophical and all those differences and tensions, because it's not about one organization. It is about our people, and anybody who is not of African heritage who relates to this issue, because in the UK, the movement here is very Pan-Africanist, Pan-Caribbean, Black internationalist. It's not about Black British people in isolation from the rest of the Black world, but it also recognizes that there are other people who have been colonized who have reparation struggles. So we recognize an international social movement for African reparations and the People's Reparations International Movement. And so those in XR, for instance, we've taken this notion of planet repairs into XR, who now embrace planet repairs as a holistic form of reparations in terms of the harm being done to people and planet, that is premised on the enslavement of Africans, the dispossession and genocide of Africans and indigenous peoples in Abya-Yala, for instance. That is recognized. And it also is about recognizing that we have the solutions. We are working on the solutions. Communities are not waiting for some handout or to be fixed by others. We've constantly done that in our struggles to humanize the world. It is difficult to do this work because some of our own community members, for instance, didn't agree that there shouldn't be, that there should be, for instance, white people, or even objected to the role of Extinction Rebellion. But we were very clear that we've been marching since 2014. We handed in this petition. A couple of years, they didn't even want to acknowledge the petition. We thought, we can't be calling people out. We're not being listened to. We have to, up the game a bit. We have to do something that is going to get attention, okay? And XR groups offered, they knew their place. They were not leading anything. In fact, all the paraphernalia, we said to them, don't come with no XR logos and branding and stuff like that. African branding. And so all of the XR artwork that they did to support us in terms of art blockers was Adinkra symbols. We chose the messaging, and we made it very clear that even if you are going to block roads, you have to stand behind our people. We have to be in front. It's our struggle. We're leading it. What happened? Let me be honest with you, what happened? A lot of our people, we said we're going to block the road, from Windrush Square to Max Roach Park. Our people were turning up hours into the afternoon. Who turned up at 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning? Some of the same allies from XR that many people were condemning. Why are you here? And we're sort of ready. Okay, if you want us to block roads, we can. And we said, no, you can't, because our people are not here. And what we don't want proliferated around the world is images of you lot, appearing on our day around African Emancipation Reparations Rebellion. So it's challenging and it's complex. But through that process, you build understanding about where you're located. And in fact, many of those that came along and supported in more ways than one really were fascinated, were really appreciative of everything that they heard by way of our own speeches and contributions and our own culture, the music, the color, the way in which we just vibed in a rebellious way. That is what we bring. And what we're also saying is that this is an issue that we expect the wider community and society of the UK to also support us with. But they also need to know that they've been lied to. So we're not just trying to restore ourselves. It's also about impacting and transforming hearts and minds, because when they wake up, they themselves will be that front line challenging their own so-called leaders or misleaders. And that's really important when let's face it, we're talking about people who are engaged in liberation struggle. And in some parts of the world, African, Asian, indigenous people are engaged in wars of national liberation, okay? So we can sit here and make statements, but practically, how are we supporting our people's war efforts? How are we defending them when multinationals that are registered on the London Stock Exchange are coming and raising lands and shooting people, and there's no justice for anyone? That's really what we are confronting. And what we work with around a theory of change is that change is brought about by people, but masses of people. And what we've also seen is that when our people have tried to stop the harm themselves, and this goes to one of the questions that I can see in terms of the role of those in the global south who are really, under neo-colonial domination, as we are as well. We're domestically neo-colonized as well. But what is our role? Now, one example I want to highlight is the Americana Massacre, because miners decided they were going to go on strike against Longrow Mine. And what happened? They were massacred. by state forces, of course in cahoots with the corporations, right? But ANC-led state forces. This is what our people are facing. Many of the land defenders are just being executed, just being disappeared. And we need to come to their assistance. Now, that's a reparation struggle, but they're just fighting it on the ground. And a lot of the time, they're not even directly like fighting it like that. They're defending themselves against the violence of others. You know, big business. Let's look at what happened with the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa in terms of the other Ogoni 9. So this is what we have to challenge, we have to counter. And ultimately, when we talk about stopping the harm of extractivism, you know, and, you know, stopping the extractivism of oil and coal and all the minerals, that is going to require support, sacrifice, internationalist solidarity, because our people and people in resistance don't wage those struggles on their own. And so our work is very much premised on not only people outside our community showing internationalist solidarity, but we ourselves, as was the case in, 10, 20 years ago, that many of the Black community groups were organizing in support or solidarity of freedom movements on the continent of Africa and in Abya Yala and other parts of the world. A lot of that has stopped now, because there's the notion that people are free, and they're not. So we ourselves are not doing as much as we can do. And as was said on the video from Global Majority by Jerry Amakondo, none of us is free until all of us are free. And freedom is not something that you win in one generation and that's it. You put your hands down and you just enjoy. Because no, what we're seeing is a rollback on the freedoms that we've won through the struggles of others, and each generation has to continue topping up, if you like, that freedom account, not only for themselves, but to ensure that whatever we do is something that is sustained across the generations. And the indigenous people, the Iroquois nation in particular, talk about the 7 generations principle, which is really important in thinking about intergenerational justice and the responsibility we have to ensure that our actions today, whatever policies, programs, solutions, we have to look at what will be the impact 7 generations from now.
Brilliant, thank you, Esther. Real talk. So just to remind people, we are going till 8 o'clock this evening. I think it may have been advertised at 7:30 earlier, so we do have a little bit more space. Thanks, Panina, in the chat. Thank you for addressing one of the questions. We've got another question as well, which we can get to. I also had another couple of questions, which you can perhaps address first. But actually, yeah, continuing on from the question of allies, if people haven't seen, there's one of my favorite Esther greatest hits on Gotkush TV. There's a part 3 of a long interview where you go into details on the question of allies, and that's where I've heard you also mention the Americana Massacre, and yeah, that as you're saying, I think that is one of the functions that people need to be aware of and what we're up against. A localized question, because RJN is based in Leeds. I know that you've also done work in other parts of the country, in Lambeth, Islington, Bristol, with their councils. And as we're seeing, a lot of councils, Leeds has declared a climate emergency. A lot of local councils have done that. What you've done, you've gone further, and you've linked, again, as we're doing today, you're linking climate justice with repair, with reparative justice, and you and help those councils declare atonement motions. So to some of that process, with a view to obviously us in Leeds and people around the globe who are listening, also to how we can also try and get our councils to sign up to reparative justice atonement motions.
Sure, that's really important to highlight, because it's not necessarily been very well publicized. And even though in the USA right now, there is a process unfolding around what's known as HR 40, which is a commission to study reparations proposals for African Americans Act. We have a similar process, not the same, in the UK, which is this process of these atonement and reparations motions for the African enslavement, basically. And it's important to talk about that process a bit because it's a process similar to HR 40 that was first introduced in Congress in 1989 and only got voted on this year. It's taken years, decades of mobilizing, and it's the same thing in Britain. So the reparations motions that passed in Islington Council first in July 2020, followed by Lambeth Council, July 2020, the Green Party of England and Wales across the whole Green Party in October 2020, and in Bristol City Council on the 2nd of March of this year, 2021. The origins of that come from the Stop the Ma'angamisi campaign that I am part of, the coordinator general of and co-founded with Kofi Mawuli-Klue and others in PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and other African support structures across the world. Now, from the 90s, when there was something called the Afrikan Reparations movement, co-founded by the late Bernie Grant and others, and Kofi Mawuli-Klue was also involved. He presented a paper at the founding conference of ARM, as it was called, the acronym, in 1993, that was basically an African self-determined path of legal struggle for Pan-African reparations, as it was referred to. And what that recognizes that we had to go beyond existing law and kind of legal mechanisms to address our reparations claim, not in a narrow legal sense, but in terms of the whole magnitude of the harm and the impact of the harm. And it was in the early 2000s, 10 years after the Abuja Proclamation, which was it was a conference coming out of Nigeria, the first Pan-African Conference on Reparations in '93, sponsored by the then Organization of African Union and bankrolled by somebody now deceased called Chief Abiola. But Bernie Grant and others went to that conference and came back and did an early day motion in Parliament, which was called the Abuja Proclamation. So 10 years after that, which was on the 5th of May, 1993, around the 5th of May, 2003, we had something called the Black Quest for Justice campaign, and PARCO, the coalition I'm part of as well, and others, including what was then the Global African Congress, that I was also part of at the time, and something called the International Front for African Reparations, which was a US structure. We initiated legal and extra legal action on Pan-African reparations for global justice, which is today what we would refer to as planet repairs. It was that kind of thinking. And so that's where the idea of these motions come from, because what the motions really call for, among other things, is the setting up of this all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, the APSITAJ, as well as a alternative world court that we refer to as the Ubuntu Gotla, People's International Tribunal for Global Justice. And the existing World Court, as people will know, is not really a world court. And in terms of the, it's a lot of these courts only prosecute, what they see as being weaker nations, but people like Tony Blair or George Bush or Boris Johnson are not put before these courts, right? So what we've said is that we need to repair the law and the legal mechanisms, and that's why we need a People's International Tribunal, which in international law from the 1960s is an alternative mechanism that's much more for the people that get formed. Anyway, The Commission of Inquiry idea, it took a while for people to support it, and it wasn't until 2019. So we have the Stop the Manganese campaign and postcards and petition. A lot of our people were not signing the petition because they were saying, oh, it's too radical. We're not facing genocide. It's too long. It's all kinds of excuses. And we felt we needed to have another way where we can not bypass our people, because we know that actually we needed to create a mechanism whereby elected officials themselves could take action directly. So a councillor from Lambeth, a Green Party councillor, white guy, Councillor Scott Ainsley, came to the 2019, then it was a reparations march, to Parliament, House of Commons, and he went all the way there, marched all the way back with us. We obviously spoke, and he saw the groundswell of support for reparations in our communities here that is not ever hardly reported on the mainstream news at all. He said, okay, I want to work with you around developing a motion for the Green Party. But then he figured, why don't I try and get a motion passed at Lambeth Council? So that Lambeth Council, it would put another layer where the councils are then empowered to act, also to request of the government to set up this commission. And that's what happened. The Stop the Manganese campaign, we co-drafted the motion. That he then had to get support from the other major party, which is the majority party, the Labour Party, and that motion got passed. It got first passed in Islington, but the Islington motion actually, sort of watered down the Commission of Inquiry idea that we had, because that's, Labour didn't want to kind of go with our formulation. And then, in October, so that was a huge victory, because what the motion does, it includes recognition of movements like Black Lives Matter, but also the Pan-African movement. And it gives a chronology of all the main landmarks in efforts to effect and secure reparations in the UK. And it mentions all the issues that we face, so the disproportionate impacts in terms of policing and deaths in custody and COVID-19 deaths. And then in the end, it sort of calls for this commission to address these issues, linking all these maladies to the question of enslavement, colonization, dispossession, and therefore reparatory justice. So after that motion got passed, this was July, we had the 1st of August, reparations rebellion of 2020 now, that this happened. And then in October of last year, working with elected officials in the Green Party, one of whom was a councillor, Cleo Lake in Bristol, who has always been supportive of and involved with, a lot of our community organising efforts on reparations. Through Cleo, working with, the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, and also Councillor Asher Craig, and driven by a structure in Bristol called the African Connections Consortium, we managed to get a Bristol motion passed, which was the first city, the third place in the country, but the first city to actually embrace this reparations motion. And I think one of the key things to say about it is that the idea of the apsitage is not just looking at harm to us as people, it's also looking at the ecological harms, the climate injustice. And the idea is that before we can fully state what the repair is, we have to allow people to be heard, because we're talking about a struggle that has been going on for centuries that impacts all of us across the globe, within and outside our communities. There's going to be no quick fixes. And what has not happened is that people have not had a right to be heard. And it's in hearing the testimonies of what we have been through, but also what we are doing by way of our own efforts to repair and redress the harm, that we can actually come up with the plan as a bottom-up organic process embedded in communities. So this is historic. Because now elected officials themselves are taking action, and we're trying to get the motion passed in Liverpool and in Birmingham and in other key cities as well. And what's happening is that communities, the elected officials are recognizing that they have to support the leadership and the agency of communities, affected communities on the ground, because that is part of the transformation or the repair, yeah, where we rediscover our ability, our agency, we can develop our self-determination, we can build our power to be the change that we need to see, and also to then enforce the kind of institutional changes as part of rebuilding forms of, you know, self-governance and autonomy. Because we can't wait another 100 of years to have full equity. So that's what the local processes are. And tied to these motions are what's known as, in Kiswahili, Pempanzi Mpango, which basically is a plan, a reparations plan in Kiswahili. So we're encouraging local plans, because obviously it's not about a few of us in any one area. We are global people, and so it's about acting locally, but recognizing that, you know, we bring all these journeys with us that will impact. And this, what we're doing here, will be connected to what's also happening around the world. And that is how we feel that we can also work with others outside of our communities who have been taught to think that reparations means that somehow money is going to be taken out of their, you know, hands or what have you, to give to undeserving people who already get enough aid. And so there's a lot of educational work that has to accompany a process like this on how our repair solutions will actually benefit not only the affected communities, but will bring about some of the systemic and structural changes that will ensure the guarantees of non-repetition dimensions of reparatory justice.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. So I think, yeah, you've tasked us as a racial justice network located in Leeds, who we do have connections with some Green Party people, Rakesha, I think you know, and others. I think that is our task with yourself as our patron. We need to be also pushing in our locality as well, and people as well listening in. Brilliant. So I'm going to get to the other question we have, but I think I'll maybe get to that via a more personal angle, which you can feel free to answer any way you want, or you know, you can go into the your analysis of structures. But this is around, I guess, the NGOization of resistance. And one of the things that I've been actually frustrated on your behalf, maybe more than yourself. I think you've kind of taken it as, you know, part of the struggle. But I've been very kind of exhausted and really I don't know, frustrated, for want of a better word, how lots of people are jumping on the reparations bandwagon and not connecting to the work that you are part of, that lineage, and they're not linking in with the work that you do, that they're not taking the time to find out about that work. Also, you know, related to the climate justice work, I think we've had lots of fanfare around climate justice activists. You know, there's reports produced with listing 100 activists, yourself, Mamadi, and people that don't make those lists, who we know are working on the grassroots and in those. We've also attempted to work on funding applications to quite a few so-called grassroots. You're laughing, but that was traumatic. You know, applying several times to these funds, which are specifically for people who can't get funds elsewhere. And I know that you're not in it for money, you're not in it for the acclaim, you're not in it to make a name. But I guess it's still frustrating, again, I'm going to come back to that word, that you are doing this work largely unsupported by these structures, and people are picking up the reparations name and managing to get funding, managing to do work which is not as embedded, not as grounded and rooted, and continuing that historical work that you're standing on the shoulders of. So yeah, if you could speak to how you keep going when all this is happening, but also, you know, what you see as some of the organizations, you know, you're maybe some of the issues that you've seen in working with some of the organizations who are getting and who are seen as doing the work, aren't necessarily connecting the legacy.
Thank you. Really powerful question, important. I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability. So the challenges are huge, and you're right. I believe there is a deliberate and concerted effort to engage in what some of us in the movement refer to as ISMA denial, and that is denial of the international social movement for African reparations. Now, that denial is sometimes done by people who are of African heritage, and sometimes it's done by people who are non-African of other heritages, okay? But also non-white heritages, and some white or so-called Caucasian European people as well. And this is a phenomenon that we've recognized, you know, in terms of a lot of the scholarship, even the reporting. And I think there are many reasons for it. But one of the reasons that is key is, and I have to put it in the mix here, is anti-Blackness, but the specific form of anti-Blackness known as Afrophobia. So traditionally, a lot of these groups, and I don't need to mention them, but you know, one or two might come up, who are taking up reparations now. Let's just be very clear. When you often hear about reparations, although yes, now that people are talking about climate reparations and reparations for all kinds of groups, I think the seminal struggle that people identify with reparations is the struggle of people of African heritage, however they self-define, whether it's Black people or what have you. And it's often said as being reparations for slavery. That's how it's often framed, because that was the foundational root of a lot of the interconnected dispossessions. If we recognize that African people are mothers and fathers of human civilization. So it is the foundational reparation struggle, actually. And a lot of the energy and the persistence of this movement that is known as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, which is intergenerational. In the UK, my own PhD research in history that I'm struggling to finish because of all the activism I do, is about the history of the international social movement in the UK. It goes back to the mid-1700s, and every generation of people of African heritage in the UK since has been championing reparations. One of the famous ones was Otobo Kugwano, who in 1797 raised the issue of restitution. Remember, the international law framework recognizes restitution as being important for African enslaved people. Okay, so there's a huge denialism about this movement and the ideas, the strategies for change, the vision of transformation that we have. And a lot of why I think that is happening is because even though we recognize like racism in terms of whiteness, you know, against the rest of the world, what we don't explore enough is the tensions between specific non-white groups and the hierarchy of race that basically puts Black, you know, at the bottom, brown in the middle, white on the top. Okay, so even the notion of Black and brown people, that never used to be the case. There used to be this recognition of Blackness, or even a notion of political Blackness, which I know has been criticized even from many African heritage communities. So what we've seen is the the denial. So even though the energy of what is attracting people, including outside of these African heritage communities, is the struggle being waged by African people, whether in Abya Yala or Africa or the Caribbean or other parts of the world. Because when people think about indigenous people, they often frame the conversation in terms of sovereignty. Aboriginal people refer to sovereignty. They might not use the term reparations, but African people also use the term sovereignty and reparations together. So that is something that needs to be recognized, but it's not. And despite the energy, so a lot of the work that I do, 99.9.9.9% is unpaid and has been for 20 years. How do I survive? Because I live in my mother's house. I'm actually 2 years, well, how old am I? I'm nearly 50, okay, in terms of my age. But I live in my mother's house. I started this activism at 28, 48, and have lost jobs because of it in terms of the politics of reparations. So there's been real struggle. And then at a certain point, you are just deemed to be too radical. When I started out 20 years ago, I was, the first job that I lost was working for an organization of Black lawyers, okay? Because then to be considered, to be a reparationist 20 years ago was the equivalent to being classified as a Black identity extremist today, okay? So even Black folk would say, no, that's a bit too radical. It's a bit too extreme. It's a bit too unrealizable. And that happened to me. Okay, so had it not been for my mother and my father, then I just would not be able. So I have nothing for myself. I don't have a property of my own. I don't drive a car of my own. I live in a home, and my family have supported me. Yeah, so I live like a historical abolitionist in terms of have gone or been privileged despite that to go all around the world, but that's because people have resourced those trips. We'd like you to come and speak with us, engage with us, educate us about reparations. How do we share? And that's how I've got to travel. I mean, I haven't traveled so much in the last couple of years, but that is the impact. And most people that I work with, it's the same thing. So when we see a movement that we have sustained, help popularize, sacrificed for, struggled for, been demonized for, persecuted for, but yet that has created capital, social and cultural capital that others can now apply for funding actually to do work in this issue. That is the NGOization of reparations that many of us resist. And we resist it because we want to stay honest. We want to stay true to our communities, because this is not about Esther or Kofi or anyone else getting a few consultancies or getting a little funding to do a little project with a local university. This is about people's lives. Millions of lives. And the nature of capitalism and racial capitalism is that it only ever allows economic advancement for a few, not the many. That's the system that we're dealing with. And to truly kind of stop the harm and ensure guarantees of non-repetition from a reparation standpoint would involve, abolishing capitalism. That's what it would entail, which is obviously not an overnight thing. Yeah, so it's a long haul struggle that we have to engage in here. But I think the root of why this is happening is because of Afrophobia. Let me say it very clear. I think that especially in this society where, it used to be BAM, B-A-M-E, okay? Now the terminology that gets used is BIPOC. Black, Indigenous, people of color. And a lot of these terminologies actually end up perpetrating erasure of Africanness. And some of us refuse to be erased. And we don't want to come under the leadership and domination of other people that are non-white. We don't want to exchange one colonizer for another. And we are proud and assertive in our Africanness, because we know what it means to be African and human. We know what it means to people the planet. We know what it means to have our bloodlines through all of the human family. And we are not giving that up, okay? We are not giving that up. And that is threatening, because others want to speak for us, appropriate our voice, our agency, our creativity, in order that they can then do what white people have done. And that is the simple way that I can explain it. Whether people like it or not, that has been my experience, and I've got the battle scars to prove it. And there are structures here that some of us, it's actually one of the questions. Could Esther say a bit more about the ways in which XR can be a dangerous and harmful environment for people of colour? What are the reasons to work with a climate group like XR rather than people of colour-led group like Wretched of the Earth? To say that some of us, as PARCO members and also members of the Global African People's Parliament, were involved with Wretched of the Earth in the early days, participated in the Wretched of the Earth block in the People's Climate March in 2016, and are no longer involved because of the same Afrophobia that I've spoken about. That is what we've experienced. And even though you might have African heritage activists, there's also a big fear of Pan-Africanism when that gets elevated. So if I am an African heritage, say LGBTIQ activist, it's not as problematic as if I'm asserting myself as an African heritage Pan-African activist as the key struggle that I'm elevating, irrespective of what my sexual orientation is, okay? Irrespective of what that is. So there is a resistance and a fear of, you know, it used to be said as a fear of a black planet, but there's a fear of African heritage agency and thought, and the ability to be self-naming, self-defining, self-determining. There is a fear. And with Wretched of the Earth, many people who've become involved since have kind of tried to facilitate these connections, but that has not happened because some of us know the platform on which we stand and know, you know, how certain perspectives that we shared were minimized, marginalized, and so forth. And so that's not a safe space for some of us either. No disrespect to anyone in Wretched of the Earth or any POC kind of formulations, but as I've already said, in terms of the work that we do via XR, which comes to the first part of the question, why would we do it? I've already explained why, in terms of the work that we're doing. This is not work that we've been supported to do by Wretched of the Earth or Friends of the Earth or any of the supporting white-led structures that sort of support Wretched of the Earth. We're doing this work on our own terms with our people. And as I've said, these networks we have are affinity networks. The communities, and we're talking about huge communities, thousands and thousands of people, and in some cases millions. If we look at the Indian farmer strike, you know, Sumana, our coordinator in India, has been part of that. That's what we're supporting, that resistance on the ground, okay? Now that work is being supported by XR, not because all these farmers are XR members. No, we've said they cannot be. XR must recognize that these are pre-existing movements of rebellion that you need to learn from here in Europe and around the world where you have XR chapters. Now you have XR chapter, you have an XR India, you have an XR Africa, but those are totally separate to what we do, because our communities are not giving up their autonomy, they're not giving up their agency, they're not giving up their voice to comply or conform to XR. And in terms of what makes it dangerous, for some of it, in terms of the notion of safety, racial or cultural safety, and the way in which activists that we work with have not felt, you know, at home in generic XR spaces, which is why we created XRISN, the International Solidarity Network, and why we have a physical space, a home It's not an office, it's a home, because we wanted a home away from home for our people. So we can stay there as long as we like. We can cook our food. We can have meetings around our culture. We can play the music we want. We can engage in the way that is going to edify our spirit.
Beautiful.
That's the reason why.
Real talk. Esther, that was amazing. We knew you'd bring the fire. Thank you for speaking so honestly on all those issues and taking us there. Obviously, like we say, there's so much more Esther can bring. There's lots of Esther's talks on various subjects, like I say, on YouTube. We're going to be engaging with you on many issues, continuing these issues of climate justice, of reparations, intertwining the two, the Pempanzie, the stitching together. We're going to be obviously making progress with the Leeds Declaration as well. And you've inspired us all. You keep inspiring us. Rest assured also that, you know, as you give, and you always sign off with your servant. You know, another common thing which I resist is the kind of queens and kings thing. I know
Yeah.
you see yourself more as a servant, which I, you know, we're all kings and queens, that's all. And I respect you for the sacrifice, and rest, like I say, rest assured it is valued by so many of us. You've given so many people who I'm sure you don't even know so much fire to continue this fight, and we salute you. Esther, I'm sure everyone else would wish to share thanks, and there's lots of messages as well saying so. Just grateful. We will continue the journey. We will move towards the Mart Ubuntu Dunia. And we're going to now close with Mamadi. So apologies for being over time, but if you're willing to stay with us, this will be beautiful. You've heard from Mamadi earlier in the 13th recommendation. Thanks once again, Esther. Thanks for all our team for supporting this conversation, and we will let you know about future things as well soon. Stay in touch, follow us, and connect, and we will build together. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to speak because my computer for the second time today has come up with cannot start video, and I had to log out and log in. So I don't know, it doesn't look like it wants to do it. So I trust that you can just bear with my voice alone. One of the things that I was asked to do was to summarize Esther. No, that's impossible. So I hope that all the words that she has spoken have thoroughly resonated through all hearts and ears, and that within the bodies that have heard her words, that they will, you know, go away and really process and work on, because it's not enough just to remember and praise and sing about, but to actually act on, as she herself has spent her life acting on. I think it is useful, and unfortunately you won't be able to see me, but to just process some of what we have heard with our bodies. So I'm just asking us to hold out our hands, our arms, and to stretch backwards, to stretch our arms backwards, knowing that this is a movement of Sankofa. We have to go back to what we have in the past and bring forth that which is there that can serve us in the present, which is the meaning of Sankofa. And then we take that which we have from the past and let's put it forward to the future that we are co-creating. So let's stretch forward to the future, yeah, that we are co-creating. Remember, when you're stretching forward to the future from the past, you have to go through the present. So you have to go through what you have now. Yeah, that Sankofa. And then if we can just stretch to the side, which is the solidarity that we always talk about, yeah, and that is reaching to each other. And this then ends up as a global movement because it's in all directions. There's an African American group called Sweet Honey in the Rock, and they have some words in a song which say, "We all, every one of us, have to come home again. You know, we were born of this earth. We remain anchored to this earth. Our very substance is from this earth. Yet somehow when we have the opportunity, we just abandon the earth to whatever we feel is far from and above whatever is the blackness and brownness of all our origins. But how on earth can that profit us? How on earth can it benefit us? When is there a benefit of losing one's mother in search of glass, concrete, and metal? How can we say we can self-actualize in a cloud that's located in virtual skies? It seems to me that we cannot do better than to thoroughly decolonize, to cleanse and repair our minds, and to see and feel beyond our mortal eyes. And to do this, we have to begin to recognize the mothers, the sisters, the daughters of the movement to liberate, repair, and heal. If we cannot come back to that, and I'm so glad, Sai, that you asked that final question and Esther's response to that, because that is the home that we have to come back to. How, no matter how difficult it is to countenance the idea that our roots are our Black mothers, sisters, and daughters. That's what we always have to come back to. And you know, if we cannot elevate and support and enshrine what these women represent, then we are in self-denial. The 13th recommendation is actually the foundation of any sane movement towards healing the trauma within. It is how justice, reparatory justice, is articulated. To fully acknowledge the colonial legacies of all harm, understanding that colonialism and coloniality was and is the seeking of an overarching power and control of all that one has objectified as being outside of oneself. That is actually some kind of definition of madness, right? Because we, as Africans, recognize we belong to the earth. There is nothing outside of that. So then to seek to make things be outside of that so that you can control it is actually a movement towards a cancer. What reparatory justice is seeking is an elimination of that cancer effectively, right? It's a movement towards a sanity that we haven't known on this planet for a very long time, yeah? So again, the 13th recommendation is talking about the international proportions of it and connecting the local, what is referred to as local and global, because, you know, everywhere you are is your local. And so everywhere else becomes a global. So it's a very Ubuntu idea and concept, right? To connect the local and global in profound and significant ways, yeah, which is to recognize meaningfully how to express with body, mind, and soul the solidarity that can and has to make a difference if reparatory justice is to be achieved. Racial Justice Network has also at its helm Penny Wangari Jones, another Black woman who may be overlooked, yeah, who is embracing this sanity. And it's, you know, it's not an accident that at these important locations, the helm of these important locations in time and space are African women, are African heritage women. It is not accidental. Okay, so let's not forget that, and let's understand our roots so that we can move towards everything that Esther has exhorted in our precious time with her this evening. So very many thanks. I'm not even going to attempt to summarize anything you say. I'm sure it's resonated through everyone. So blessings to all that we move with that power forward. Ashe.